Jonah is a part of that portion of the Old Testament known as the minor prophets. This is a distinction that scholars make just because Jonah is among those prophetic books that are short. And they're all lined up in our version of the Old Testament right here next to each other. That distinguishes them from what are known as the major prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, just because those are longer texts. If you've read, though, these books of the minor prophets, you'll notice that Jonah really sticks out like a sore thumb. It's very distinctive from the other prophets because it doesn't contain a lot of words from the prophet himself to the people. Most of the prophetic books found in the Bible are heavy on the prophecies, the messages that God gives them to deliver to the people. And we don't have a lot of personal details about the lives of the prophets. But in the book of Jonah, there's just one sentence that represents what Jonah says to the people. Instead, Jonah, unlike the other minor prophets, focuses more on him and who he is and two very important relationships in his life. His relationship with God and his relationship with his enemies. Jonah is one of the Hebrew people. He is one of the people that believes that they are part of God's chosen people. And he has a special relationship with his people and with God. And God calls him and asks him to go to the city of Nineveh and to declare to them that they are going to have destruction come upon them. But Jonah doesn't want to do that because the Ninevites are his enemy. They are the capital of what was the Assyrian Empire. And he very much would like to see them destroyed. So he goes to great lengths to try to go in the other direction. But through the events that I described with the children this morning, he's brought back to the gates of Nineveh, where he goes in and he delivers to them the message that God gave them, or maybe in an abbreviated form. That's the one sentence of what he says to the people. And all he says to them is, 40 days more, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. There's no mention in this of God. There's no mention of any hope of redemption. Just that 40 days you are going to be destroyed. So brace yourself and prepare for it. And then as a result of that, the Ninevites hear this message. And amazingly, even though it was developed or delivered in such a harsh way, they repent. And everybody within the entire city, we're told, male and female, old and young, people of high esteem like the king, as well as laborers and people who worked the field. In the portion that's left out of what Marcella read this morning, it even said that repentance included the beasts of the field, such as cattle and sheep. And everyone was made to put on sackcloth and put ashes on their head. This was the kind of humble attire that people donned whenever they wanted to show they were repentant and sorry for the sins that they had committed. And they fasted and they prayed. And amazingly, God sees their acts and he forgives them and he spares their city. This brings to mind a concept that's very important for us as Christians. It has to do with the universality of sin. It says that sin is in the world and it prevents the world from being the way God would like the world to be. And it also says that each of us plays some part in making the world sinful. I may not be tempted by the same types of things as you are, but each of us in our own way is doing something to prevent the world from looking how God would like it to be. And the Ninevites amazingly respond to Jonah's message by putting on sackcloth and ashes on their head. And everyone in the city and even the beasts of the fields are included in as a way to show that sin is universal and it pervades. It's what the Apostle Paul in his letter to the Romans, chapter 3 said. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And in relationship to what they do, God sees their act and forgives them. This is also a reflection of what we in Christian terms refer to as grace. We're all equally sinful, but we're all also equally loved by God, and God's mercy is available for all of us. Jonah is one of those fascinating books that challenges us when we oversimplify the Bible. Sometimes people will talk about the Bible in broad terms, and they'll say, well, I don't like the Old Testament. The God of the Old Testament seems to be vengeful and a warlike God. But those of you who have followed the bishop's challenge last year to read through the entire Bible, you know that that's not entirely true. That there are some harsh and some tough bits to deal with in the New Testament. And you also have the book of Jonah here in the middle of the Old Testament. An entire book about love of enemy. We don't have to wait until we get to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel to confront that topic. Here it is, facing us now. Jonah's writer also has a wonderful sense of comic irony, because Jonah is one of the Hebrew people, one of God's own chosen. But it's the people that Jonah considers his enemy, the people that he would like to see God destroy, who wind up being more devout and more righteous than he is. Starting with the sailors aboard the ship. He is aboard the ship fleeing from God's presence. And I love the way it's described because it helps us imagine what it was like to live in a polytheistic world. A world where different people believed in different gods. And they believed that gods and goddesses were regional. That the God of your territory oversaw you where you were. But the God of my territory oversees me in my home. And they believed that this storm that was caused was the work of some god. It reminds us of Odysseus in Homer's epic poem, who is headed back from the Trojan War. And because some god has it in for him, he's blown around the Mediterranean and has all these adventures throughout the year. And the sailors, in what is an incredible phrase, go around the ship saying to one another, pray to your God and see if maybe your God is responsible for what we are encountering. And finally they get to Jonah, who confesses. And he says, I serve the God who created the heavens and the earth, the land and the water, and I am fleeing from what this God has called me to do. This storm is because of me. Throw me overboard and the storm will end. But amazingly, these strangers, these people who worship gods other than the one of Jonah, prove that they have higher ethical character than he, because they can't bear to throw him overboard. So they try desperately other measures to try to save the ship, but none of them work. So finally they relent and they toss him overboard. And you know the story about how he goes under the waves and a great fish takes him. And 3 days later he's spit up on the shore. And he goes into the Ninevites and he delivers this message to them. But they show that they are more devout and righteous than he is himself. He has judged the Ninevites to only be worth destruction. But they see within the God in whose name he represents this message, a God of hope and a God of deliverance. And amazingly, the entire city repents. It's the kind of revival I wish for every church I've ever served and every church within our connection. That kind of universal recognizing that each of us is doing something to make this world and this community not like God would want it to be. And each of us bearing responsible for what we have done and holding one another up and looking to God's mercy and grace to lift us up out of that. There's an opposite to this sort of way of thinking that's very popular in our society and in Jonah's as well. And that is, instead of looking at sinfulness as something we all bear responsibility for, encapsulating it maybe within a small group within a church, or a larger group within a society. And to say that all of our problems are the responsibility of this group of people over here. And if we can just eliminate them, the way Jonah wants God to do with the Ninevites, or maybe just shame them or disempower them, then we will finally have the utopia we have hoped for. There are many people who try to live by that. You and I might have lived by that at some point or another in our lives. But it never works out. Whenever we isolate or run away those people that we want to blame for everything, those same troubles come back. That's because we're all called to this same style, Nineveh repentance. Everyone, the young and the old, people of all stages, putting on sackcloth and ashes and seeking God's forgiveness, and knowing that God's mercy and God's lifting up is available to all. Now, as we interact with other people, and as we decide what we need to do and what's right and what's wrong, we do need to make value judgments. We don't have to condemn somebody to be damned in order to evaluate what that person may do or not do. That's one of the ways that we learn. That's one of the ways that we seek to live righteous lives. But when we do that, we must do so with the knowledge that we are all equally sinful and all equally loved and forgiven by God. It's a careful trick, but the secret to it is when we look at someone else and we judge or evaluate that person's actions or what that person does or does not do, we must do so wearing sackcloth and ashes. That is the amazing, comic message that Jonah gives us. And that is the repentance, the revival, and the mercy that awaits this congregation.